Nick Reiner has never been the loudest person in the room, and for a long time, that quietness was interpreted as confidence. The kind of calm you're supposed to have when your last name carries weight, when the industry already knows where to place you before you even open your mouth. But lately, that calm has felt different, less like composure, more like restraint. And that's why his latest confession didn't just surprise people. It stopped them. It didn't arrive with a flashy announcement or a dramatic sit-down special. It came in the most unsettling way possible, casually, almost like he wasn't sure anyone would notice. A few sentences that sounded too personal to be scripted, too raw to be strategic. And the moment those words hit the internet, fans did what they always do when something feels real. They replayed it, slowed it down, compared it to older clips, and started connecting the dots they'd ignored for years. Because Nick didn't confess to something like a tabloid would frame it. He confessed to a feeling, a pressure, a long-running internal battle that he'd apparently been carrying in silence while the world assumed he was fine. The tone was what shook people most. It wasn't angry. It wasn't defensive. It was tired, like someone finally admitting that the version of himself the public thinks exists is only part of the story, and maybe the smallest part. When someone in a famous family speaks, the public automatically listens for blame. Who hurt you? Who did what? What secret are you exposing? But Nick's confession wasn't an accusation. It was something colder and more uncomfortable, an admission that he had been managing a reality that no one could see, and he'd gotten good at making it look easy. He talked like a person who has spent years smoothing the edges of his own truth so it wouldn't disturb anyone else. And then, for once, he stopped smoothing. Fans picked up on the way he chose his words, careful but not polished. The way he paused, like he was deciding in real time whether he should keep going. That's what made people speechless. Not some explosive detail, but the unmistakable sense that he was saying the kind of truth you don't say unless you're ready to change something. In celebrity culture, where everything is branding and optics, sincerity lands like a shockwave. Almost immediately, the reaction split into two lanes. One side went searching for scandal, trying to force the confession into a neat headline. Family conflict, career trouble, relationship strain, some hidden fallout that would explain the shift. The other side, arguably the louder side this time, heard something else. A person describing the cost of living inside expectations that were never fully his to begin with. And that's when the older footage started resurfacing. Fans began rewatching moments where Nick smiled politely while someone else spoke over him. Moments where he laughed a little too late or answered a question in a way that sounded correct but hollow. Back then, those clips looked normal. Now, people are seeing them differently, like he was always performing okay. Like he was always one step ahead of the conversation because he couldn't afford to be caught off guard. It's the same reevaluation the internet does when it realizes a celebrity wasn't private. They were protecting themselves. And then there's the last name factor, the part most people pretend doesn't matter, but it always does. When you're connected to a famous legacy, you inherit opportunities, yes, but you also inherit assumptions. People decide you're lucky, protected, untouchable. They expect you to be grateful, to be steady, to never struggle in a way that inconveniences the narrative. If you do struggle, you're supposed to struggle quietly. Because from the outside, you don't deserve a hard life. That's the cruelty of public perception. It measures pain against privilege, as if the two can't exist together. Nick's confession felt like a rejection of that bargain. Not aggressively, more like he finally acknowledged it out loud. And once you say something out loud, you can't unsay it. That's why the people around him seemed to shift afterward, at least according to fans watching closely. Not necessarily with statements, but with energy, with distance, with careful neutrality. Because when one person breaks the unspoken rule of silence, everyone else has to decide whether they'll support that honesty or contain it. The most unsettling possibility isn't that Nick revealed one shocking secret. It's that he may have opened the door to a much larger conversation he's been avoiding for years. Confessions like this are rarely isolated. They're usually the first crack in a wall, followed by boundaries, changes, and decisions that the public won't understand until later. A person doesn't speak like that unless something has shifted internally, a breaking point, a wake-up call, or simply the exhaustion of pretending. So what happens now? That's the question fans can't stop asking. Was this the beginning of a bigger story? Something like a longer interview, a personal project, a memoir, a public reset? Or was it a single moment of honesty that accidentally became a headline? Because people are starving for anything authentic. Either way, the impact is already real. Because for the first time in a long time, Nick Reiner didn't sound like someone maintaining an image. He sounded like someone trying to reclaim himself. After that confession began circulating, the first thing that changed wasn't Nick Reiner's public presence. It was the public's interpretation of everything he'd done before. Suddenly, nothing felt random anymore. A quiet expression in an old clip, a missed appearance, a vague answer that used to pass as normal privacy. Fans started treating those moments like evidence, and the story began building itself in real time. That is the strange power of a confession that doesn't spell everything out. It forces people to fill in the blanks, and the blanks always become louder than the words. But here's what most people miss. When someone like Nick opens the door, even slightly, the most dangerous part isn't what gets revealed to the audience. It's what changes behind the scenes. Because a family with a legacy, an image, and a public-facing history doesn't just absorb honesty without consequences. Even when nobody says anything publicly, internal dynamics shift. Conversations get tense. Priorities get rearranged. People start asking questions they avoided for years. And if Nick's confession was truly as personal as fans believe, then the ripple effects would not be limited to the internet. They'd hit home. That's why the next few days mattered. Viewers began watching for what came after the confession, because after is where you find intention. Did Nick walk it back? Did he clarify? Did he go silent? Did his circle respond? In these situations, the absence of a follow-up can be the follow-up. When a celebrity or public figure drops a vulnerable truth and then retreats, it often signals one of two things. Either the moment was spontaneous and they're now dealing with the fallout, or it was deliberate and they're choosing to let the message settle without giving the public anything else to twist. And the twist is always what the internet wants. Some fans immediately tried to convert the confession into a single neat storyline, something they could summarize in one sentence, something that would make perfect sense if you just believed the right theory. But the more realistic possibility is far messier. Nick's confession may not be about one dramatic event. It may be about years of accumulated pressure. The slow erosion that happens when you're expected to be stable, grateful, and unbothered, while privately struggling with the feeling that your life belongs to other people. That's the part that hits hardest for audiences right now, because culture has changed. People are more aware of mental health language, more aware of how fame can distort identity, more aware of what it looks like when someone has been performing fine. And if Nick's confession was essentially an admission of that performance, then it reframes everything. His career choices, his distance from the spotlight, his tone in interviews, even the way he carries himself when cameras are rolling. Fans aren't just curious anymore. They feel protective, like they witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. But protection can turn into obsession fast. The more people try to save a celebrity, the more they invade the exact boundaries that person is trying to set. If Nick is attempting to reclaim privacy and control, the last thing he needs is a public hunting for clues in every movement. And yet, that's exactly what happens when the confession is incomplete. Every photograph becomes a statement. Every absence becomes suspicious. Every new project becomes either a distraction or a cry for help, depending on what the internet is in the mood to believe. What complicates this further is the Reiner name itself. In Hollywood, legacy isn't just family, it's infrastructure. It's connections, relationships, expectations, and a long memory. People don't simply respond to what you do. They respond to what your name represents. So if Nick's confession hinted at discomfort with that legacy, or frustration with the role he's been assigned, the emotional stakes go beyond gossip. It becomes a question of identity. Who are you when the world already decided you should be someone else? And that's where this speechless reaction starts making sense. Fans didn't go quiet because they heard a scandal. They went quiet because they recognized a particular kind of pain, the pain of being misunderstood while being watched. It's one of the most isolating experiences a person can have. You become visible to everyone, but known by almost no one. And if Nick's confession was his way of saying, "You don't actually know what I've been living with," then it's not just dramatic. It's personal. It's a line drawn in public. Now the real question is what Nick does next. If he chooses to clarify, he risks turning a human moment into a media event. If he chooses silence, he risks letting the narrative run wild. If he chooses a bigger platform, long-form interview, written statement, documentary-style conversation, he risks opening wounds that were held together by avoidance. But he also gains something: agency. The ability to tell his story in his own framing, rather than letting everyone else define it. And there's another possibility, the one fans rarely consider because it's not as entertaining. Nick may not owe anyone more. The confession may have been exactly what it needed to be, a boundary-setting truth, not a plot teaser. In real life, people confess because they need relief, not because they want an audience. The audience just shows up anyway. Still, the timing is what keeps people talking. Confessions don't appear in a vacuum. They usually surface when something has already shifted internally, when a relationship changes, when a professional era ends, when grief or responsibility hits harder than usual, or when someone realizes they can't keep carrying the same burden without it changing them permanently. If Nick is at that kind of turning point, then the confession is less a climax and more a beginning. So watch what happens next. Not in the tabloid sense, but in the behavioral sense. Does he become more open or more distant? Does he choose smaller, more personal projects? Does he step away from certain circles? Does he start speaking with more clarity, even if it's uncomfortable? Because when someone finally admits they've been holding their breath for years, the next step is either healing or collapse. And fans, whether they realize it or not, are watching a person decide which one it will be. And if Nick Reiner's confession felt like a crack in the wall, it's because it was. The wall wasn't just privacy. It was expectation. It was legacy. It was the pressure to keep everything neat for the people who benefit from a clean story. But the moment you admit the story isn't clean, you take away its power over you. That's why it shook people. Because it wasn't just a confession. It was a refusal to keep pretending. And there's one more layer that makes this moment so combustible. The way a confession changes the balance of power. Before Nick said anything, the public had only two options: assume everything was fine or rely on secondhand speculation. But the moment he spoke with even a hint of vulnerability, he did something far more disruptive than spilling tea. He made it clear that he has his own version of events, and that the polished narrative people have been consuming might not be the full picture. In Hollywood, that's not just personal. That's political. Because once a person signals they are willing to speak, everyone around them starts thinking in terms of risk management. Not necessarily because anyone is guilty of something dramatic, but because the entertainment ecosystem runs on predictability. Studios, agents, publicists, even friends, everyone benefits when a public figure stays consistent. A confession introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is what reputations are built to avoid. This is why fans started noticing how carefully the conversation shifted afterward. Not through direct denials or public statements, but through the subtle machinery of image control. Invitations that don't come. Questions that don't get asked. Coverage that suddenly becomes vague. It's not hard proof of anything, but it's a recognizable pattern for anyone who's watched celebrity cycles long enough. When an uncomfortable truth starts surfacing, the response isn't always confrontation. Often it's containment. And containment can look like kindness. It can look like respecting privacy. It can look like not feeding the rumor mill. But it can also be a strategy. Keep the moment from turning into a wider narrative. Because the wider narrative is what becomes uncontrollable. If Nick's confession is interpreted as the beginning of a longer story about identity, family pressure, industry expectations, or personal struggle, then the story stops being about one person's feelings. It becomes about the systems that shaped those feelings. And systems do not like being examined. That's what makes this so tense. Fans aren't just reacting to the confession. They're reacting to the possibility that the confession was a warning shot. A signal that Nick is done protecting a version of reality that was never his to maintain. Even if he didn't name names, even if he didn't specify events, the shift in tone alone suggested he's no longer willing to carry everything quietly. That kind of shift doesn't happen unless the cost of silence has become higher than the cost of speaking. So the question becomes, what is Nick protecting now? Because once someone breaks their own silence, the why changes. Before, silence could have meant fear, loyalty, or avoidance. After a confession, silence often becomes strategy. People sometimes assume that if a celebrity doesn't elaborate, it means they were exaggerating or they regret what they said. But there's another interpretation that's far more realistic. They've realized just how dangerous honesty can be when the internet is listening. If Nick says too much, he risks being framed as ungrateful, unstable, or attention-seeking. The usual labels applied when someone disrupts a comfortable narrative. If he says too little, he risks being dismissed. And if he tries to correct the internet's assumptions, he risks amplifying them. It's a trap many public figures fall into. The moment you address speculation, you validate it. The moment you ignore it, you let it grow. Either way, you lose control. And control is exactly what Nick seemed to be reaching for. That's why the most meaningful clues may not come from what he says next, but from what he chooses to do. Decisions speak. Projects speak. The way someone reorients their life speaks. If Nick begins selecting work that feels more personal, more grounded, more removed from the legacy expectations attached to his name, that alone would confirm the confession wasn't just a mood, it was a pivot. If he steps away from certain circles and becomes more selective about public exposure, that would suggest he's not seeking attention. He's seeking stability. And stability is often the real goal behind these moments. Confessions don't always mean a person is about to expose everything. Sometimes they mean the opposite. They're finally creating a boundary out loud so they can stop bleeding quietly. It's the psychological difference between being trapped in a narrative and taking ownership of it. Even if the public never gets the full story, the person telling it can feel the difference immediately. Still, fans keep circling one uncomfortable idea. The confession sounded like someone admitting regret. Regret is potent because it hints at time wasted, time mismanaged, time spent trying to be what other people needed. When Nick's tone shifted into that territory, it didn't feel like a celebrity talking. It felt like a human being looking back and realizing how long he had been living in a role. Not a movie role, a life role. And when you realize that it can trigger something dramatic, even if it happens quietly. That's why people are now reevaluating the phrase, "he has everything." Because everything is a surface-level inventory. Access, connections, recognition, comfort. But everything doesn't guarantee peace. In fact, for some people, everything becomes the reason they can't admit they're struggling. The public expects gratitude, and gratitude becomes a muzzle. Nick's confession, at least as fans interpreted it, felt like he finally loosened that muzzle. And the most shocking part of all is that the audience didn't punish him for it. Not the way they used to. Many viewers didn't rush to accuse. They rushed to understand. That shift says as much about culture as it does about Nick. People are tired of perfectly packaged celebrities. They can sense PR language like a perfume in the air. So when someone speaks with an edge of realness, hesitation, fatigue, humility, it lands. It lands hard. But there's a danger in that too. The public's hunger for authenticity can turn a person into a symbol. Nick doesn't just become Nick. He becomes proof of whatever narrative people already believe about fame, family, or pressure. And symbols get consumed. They get projected onto. They get used. If Nick wants to keep his humanity intact, he will have to be careful not to let the internet convert his confession into a brand. Which brings us to the moment we're in now, the quiet after the shock. This is where celebrity stories usually reveal their true direction. If the confession was a leak, the next move will be damage control. If it was a decision, the next move will be intentional. If it was a boundary, the next move will be distance. And if it was the beginning of healing, the next move will be consistency. Small changes, repeated over time, that show a person is choosing themselves. So yes, fans are shocked, but not because they heard a scandal. They're shocked because they heard a shift, a crack in the performance, a hint that Nick Reiner may finally be stepping out of the role people wrote for him. And if that's true, then the most dramatic part of this story won't be what he confesses next. It will be what he refuses to keep carrying, no matter who expected him to. What's fascinating is how quickly the conversation around Nick Reiner shifted from "what did he mean" to "what are we not allowed to hear?" Because once the public senses a story is being managed, curiosity turns into suspicion. Fans started watching the media coverage with a different lens, less focused on the confession itself and more focused on the reaction to it. Which outlets repeated it? Which ones ignored it? Which ones softened the language? Which ones suddenly became careful about framing? In celebrity culture, the loudest signal is often coordination. And coordination does not always mean wrongdoing. Sometimes it simply means protection. A family name can be a brand, and brands are guarded, even when the people inside them are hurting. If Nick's confession even hinted at long-term pressure, complicated dynamics, or the psychological cost of expectation, then it isn't surprising that people around him would want to keep things calm. But calm can be expensive. It usually requires someone to carry discomfort privately, so the public doesn't have to sit with it. That's why the audience reacted so intensely. Nick's words didn't feel like a public relations adjustment. They felt like a refusal to keep paying that price. There's also the issue of timing, because confessions rarely surface when life is stable. People speak when something has tipped. A relationship changes. A professional chapter closes. A personal milestone forces reflection. Or a private burden becomes heavy enough that silence starts to feel dangerous. If Nick is at any one of those thresholds, then this moment isn't about one interview clip. It's about a larger internal shift that has been building for years, unseen. Fans began pointing to the before and after in his demeanor. Earlier appearances where Nick seemed lighter, more present, more willing to play along with the public-facing script. Then later appearances where he looked like he was measuring every word, like he was trying not to reveal too much. The difference isn't always dramatic, but it's consistent. And consistency is what convinces people. One strange interview can be an off day. A pattern is a story. Some viewers also started focusing on Nick's relationship with the public itself. Because there's a subtle tension that happens when a person grows up adjacent to fame. You are watched without choosing to be watched. People feel entitled to explanations you never agreed to give. They ask personal questions because they assume the family brand includes access. But personal identity does not function like a public franchise. It breaks when it's treated that way. If Nick's confession carried even a hint of "I'm done performing this," then it's not just a personal moment. It's a boundary being set against an entire culture of entitlement. And boundaries, ironically, are what create the most drama, not the lack of boundaries. The public can tolerate almost anything if they feel they're being fed. But the moment a celebrity says, even indirectly, "you don't get all of me," the audience splits. One side respects it. The other side takes it as a challenge. That is why the confession kept trending. It wasn't just content. It was conflict between access and autonomy. At the center of all this is a question that keeps resurfacing. Does Nick feel trapped by the role people assign him? Not by any single person necessarily, but by the combination of legacy, perception, and expectation. A famous last name is a door, but it's also a label. It can flatten you into a supporting character in someone else's story. And if Nick's confession was his first attempt at rewriting his own narrative, then the shock makes sense. Audiences are used to watching celebrities build brands. They're not used to watching them dismantle one. This is also why the confession feels like it could lead somewhere bigger. Not because Nick owes details, but because the emotional tone suggested a process, not a one-off moment. People who casually vent usually sound casual. People who are making a change sound different. They sound deliberate without trying. And Nick sounded like someone who has been thinking for a long time about what he can no longer carry. That is not the voice of someone chasing a headline. That is the voice of someone nearing a decision. The internet, of course, wants the decision to be dramatic, a public break, a major reveal, a confrontation, a statement that forces everyone to pick sides. But the more realistic outcome is quieter and more mature, and, frankly, more unsettling. A person who has spent years being controlled by expectation may not erupt. They may withdraw. They may simplify their life. They may stop cooperating with narratives that don't serve them. They may become less available, less explainable, less predictable. That kind of shift is difficult for fans to accept because it removes them from the center of the story. And that's where the real tension now lives. Not in what Nick said, but in what he might stop doing. Will he stop showing up to events where he's expected to smile and confirm that everything is fine? Will he stop accepting roles that feel like they're chosen to maintain an image rather than express a person? Will he stop allowing others to speak for him, directly or indirectly, through curated messages and carefully framed updates? The confession has primed the audience to read his choices as messages, whether he intends them that way or not. Then there's the question of trust. When a confession lands with the public, it creates an immediate demand. Be honest with us. But honesty is not a performance, and it doesn't scale well. The moment you try to satisfy the crowd's appetite for truth, truth becomes content. It becomes an endless obligation. If Nick wants to protect his mental and emotional space, he may have to disappoint people who are currently rooting for him. He may have to say nothing, even when saying nothing makes him look guilty, evasive, or controlled. That is the paradox of celebrity vulnerability. The more human you appear, the more the world expects you to be available. Still, one factor keeps pulling the story forward. The possibility that Nick's confession was not the first time he tried to speak, just the first time people heard him. Many public figures test the waters before they say something larger. They drop a sentence. They watch the reaction. They see who supports them and who panics. They learn how quickly the narrative twists. If this was Nick testing the waters, then the next step won't be random. It will be calculated, not as manipulation, but as self-preservation. And if that's true, then the most important moment may not be a headline at all. It may be a quiet decision in the background, choosing a different team, distancing from certain pressures, setting hard boundaries with people who benefited from his silence, or committing to a life that isn't optimized for public consumption. Those decisions don't trend the same way scandals do, but they are far more consequential. Because here's what the audience is slowly realizing. Nick's confession didn't promise a reveal. It signaled a shift in power from the story being told about him to the story being shaped by him. That's why it's so destabilizing. It suggests the next chapter may not be designed to entertain. It may be designed to free him. And when a person is preparing to free themselves, the first thing they do is stop explaining. The second thing they do is stop asking permission. The third thing they do is take one step that looks small from the outside, but changes everything on the inside. If Nick Reiner is at that stage now, then the shock fans feel today may be nothing compared to what happens when he finally makes that step public, without warning, without softness, and without giving anyone the closure they think they deserve. The reason this story refuses to die down is that it's no longer about a single moment. It's about a pattern of emotional honesty that people are not used to seeing from someone in Nick Reiner's position. When the public senses a pattern, they stop treating it like entertainment and start treating it like a turning point. And turning points trigger one of the most powerful forces in celebrity culture: prediction. Fans don't just ask what happened. They try to guess what's coming next. That's why, after the confession, the smallest shifts became amplified. A slightly shorter public appearance. A more guarded answer. A new project choice that didn't align with the usual safe path. The public began reading these details like signals, and the narrative evolved from Nick is struggling to Nick is preparing. Preparing for what? Exactly, depends on who you ask, but the consensus is striking. People think he is getting ready to reclaim something he lost. And when a person reclaims something, it often looks like disruption to everyone who benefited from them staying the same. In celebrity families, identity is rarely owned by the individual alone. It's shared, negotiated, sometimes even silently enforced. There are expectations that don't need to be spoken because they've been repeated for decades. Don't embarrass the family. Don't complicate the brand. Don't make private pain public. Even if no one is explicitly controlling Nick, the environment itself can create a kind of invisible leash. You learn what gets rewarded. You learn what gets punished. You learn which truths cause discomfort. And over time, you stop telling those truths. Not because you're lying, but because you're managing peace. Nick's confession felt like a break from that management. A crack in the everything is fine posture. And that's why it resonated with people who have never met him. Because so many viewers recognize the dynamic. Being the easy one, the quiet one. The person who keeps things stable so others don't have to deal with chaos. The world romanticizes that role, but living it is exhausting. Now, there's a critical point here that fans often overlook. A confession doesn't always mean someone is ready to reveal facts. Sometimes it means they are ready to acknowledge harm without litigating every detail. That distinction matters. If Nick is dealing with pressure, regret, or emotional consequences tied to his upbringing and proximity to fame, he might not want to turn his life into a public case file. He may want to tell a truth without naming villains. Because naming villains invites war. And war invites headlines he may not want. So instead, the confession becomes a different kind of statement. I have been carrying something. I'm not carrying it alone anymore. It's a boundary disguised as vulnerability. And boundaries trigger fear, not just in audiences, but in systems. This is where things get especially tense. Because when a public figure sets boundaries, the industry often responds with subtle friction, not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of habit. The system is designed to extract access, extract relatability, extract content. If Nick becomes less accessible, less willing to answer certain questions, less willing to play along, he may be treated as difficult. Not publicly, not overtly, but through quiet consequences, fewer invitations, fewer opportunities, less flattering coverage. People may frame it as he's changed, as if growth is a betrayal. And if Nick has already spent years feeling trapped in an assigned role, being punished for setting boundaries would only confirm his deepest fear, that he is valued more for what he provides than for who he is. This is why the audience is holding its breath right now, because the next move is going to reveal which direction this truly goes. If Nick leans into openness, we might see a more structured message, a long-form interview where he clarifies the emotional reality without feeding the rumor machine. If he leans into privacy, we might see the opposite, reduced public presence, fewer personal references, a shift toward work that speaks for him. Either route is meaningful. Either route suggests the confession was not a slip, it was a marker. And there's a third route that many people don't consider because it's less dramatic but far more realistic. Nick may take time, quietly, to stabilize. He may not capitalize on the moment at all. He may not respond to trending conversation. He may let the public argue with itself while he focuses on the slow, boring work of rebuilding a life that feels like his. That wouldn't satisfy the internet, but it would make the confession make sense. Because healing is not a spectacle, and the public is addicted to spectacle. The most unsettling thing about Nick's confession is that it makes the audience confront a question they usually avoid. What do we do when a celebrity story isn't a scandal, but a human being? Viewers are trained to pick sides, demand details, and treat silence like guilt. But what if silence is simply the only way to survive the noise? What if the truth isn't a bombshell, but a long-term ache? What if the shock is that nothing illegal happened? Just something painful, something personal, something that doesn't fit neatly into the internet's thirst for winners and villains. That's the kind of story that leaves people speechless because it doesn't give them the comfort of a clean conclusion. And yet, people keep pushing for one. They want the real reason. They want the one thing Nick confessed. They want to label it, summarize it, turn it into a headline that feels satisfying. But real life rarely offers that kind of resolution. Real life offers layers. Regret mixed with gratitude, love mixed with resentment, loyalty mixed with exhaustion. If Nick's confession is about the complicated truth of living inside a legacy, then it will never be reducible to a single line. Still, there's one thing that seems increasingly clear. Nick's relationship with his own narrative has changed. Before, he appeared to be navigating the public's expectations. Now, he appears to be negotiating with them. That is a subtle but enormous difference. It suggests he is no longer willing to be defined by assumptions, whether those assumptions are flattering or cruel. So the most important thing to watch is not whether he reveals more. It's whether he behaves like someone who has permission to be himself. Does he speak with more certainty? Does he stop over-explaining? Does he allow awkwardness to exist instead of smoothing it out? Does he choose projects that feel true rather than strategic? Does he disappear for a while and return different? Those are the real signals of transformation. Not a scandal, not a headline. A shift in how a person occupies their own life. And if Nick Reiner is truly entering that phase, then the confession wasn't the dramatic moment people think it was. It was the first time the public heard the sound of someone stepping out of a cage. The shock wasn't what he said. The shock was what it implied, that the version of Nick people have been watching may have been a compromise. And if he is done compromising, the next chapter won't be written for the audience. It will be written against the audience's expectations. And that, in celebrity culture, is the most dramatic move of all. What makes this moment feel so volatile is that it has begun to expose something the public usually refuses to admit. The audience is not just watching Nick Reiner's life, they are participating in it. Every reaction, every theory, every stitched-together timeline turns his private experience into a public object. And that creates a new kind of pressure that doesn't come from family legacy or Hollywood expectation, but from the people who claim to care the most. Because once a confession resonates, fans start treating it like a promise. They expect follow-up. They expect clarity. They expect the next chapter to arrive on schedule, as if emotional truth is a series with weekly episodes. But if Nick's confession was real in the way it sounded, exhausted, careful, heavy, then the most likely next step isn't more disclosure. It's retreat. It's consolidation. It's a person realizing, I can't give them access to my healing the way I gave them access to my image. That's why the silence afterward becomes so charged. In a normal celebrity cycle, silence is interpreted as PR damage control. In a human cycle, silence is often the only place recovery can happen. Nick's confession created a collision between those two cycles. The media wants momentum. The internet wants answers. But the person in the center may only want quiet. And quiet is difficult when everyone is listening. It also doesn't help that the confession landed at a time when audiences are especially sensitive to the performance of perfection. People are tired of curated vulnerability, the I'm struggling statements that are designed to still look attractive, still look controlled, still feel safe. Nick's confession didn't feel safe. That's why it hit. It sounded like someone speaking despite the consequences, not because it would benefit him. And when you show that kind of honesty, you can't easily go back to the old version of yourself without looking like you're retreating or hiding. So now the public is watching for a tell. Not a headline. A tell. They're watching for whether he keeps showing up the same way. Whether his demeanor softens or hardens. Whether his circle tightens. Whether he stops doing certain appearances entirely. Because fans understand, maybe more than they want to, that confession is often the beginning of a separation. Not necessarily from people. Sometimes from a life pattern. From a routine. From a persona. And if Nick is separating from persona, that has implications far beyond him. The persona is what everyone is comfortable with. The persona is the version that doesn't demand anything from others. It doesn't challenge family systems, professional expectations, or the audience's entitlement. It smiles, it thanks people, it stays vague, it remains fine. If Nick is done being that, then the discomfort won't just be internal. It will spread outward. It will force the people around him, family, colleagues, friends, to adjust to a new reality, that he may no longer be willing to absorb pressure to keep everyone else comfortable. That's where the drama actually is, even if no one ever names it out loud. Because the most destabilizing truth in any family system is when the easy one stops being easy. If Nick has been the person who kept things smooth, who didn't push back, who didn't demand explanations, who didn't force uncomfortable conversations, then a shift in his behavior would feel seismic. Not because he is being cruel, but because he is being honest. And honesty changes the rules. It changes what can be ignored. It changes what must be addressed. This is why fans keep replaying the same phrase he used, or the same pause he took, or the same look he had before he continued. They're sensing the presence of a larger story underneath the confession, whether it's about identity, loyalty, regret, or the complicated cost of being connected to a famous name. People don't speak with that tone unless they've been negotiating with themselves for a long time. And when you've been negotiating for a long time, you eventually stop negotiating. You decide. The public tends to imagine that decision as explosive, but it's more often subtle. It's a refusal to attend one more event that feels performative. It's a choice to stop answering certain questions. It's an insistence on being treated like a person rather than an extension of a legacy. Those choices don't create one giant headline. They create a slow shift that the public can feel but can't neatly summarize. And slow shifts drive the internet insane because they don't provide closure. Which is why so many people are now trying to force closure by inventing certainty. They want to know what the confession really meant because ambiguity is uncomfortable. Ambiguity forces you to sit with complexity, and complexity is not what celebrity culture is designed to handle. Celebrity culture wants clear villains, clear victims, clear timelines. But Nick's confession, at least as the public heard it, suggested something more realistic. A person who has been living in contradiction, loving his family and still feeling pressure, benefiting from legacy and still feeling trapped, being grateful and still being hurt. Those contradictions aren't scandal. They're life. And life is what the audience didn't expect to hear. Now, there's another possibility that has begun to circulate, and it's not about gossip. It's about intent. Some viewers believe Nick's confession may have been a strategic form of self-defense. Not strategy in the PR sense, but in the emotional sense. If you know the narrative around you is about to change, sometimes you speak first so you aren't silenced later. You establish that you have a voice, that you have a perspective, that you are not merely a character in someone else's story. You signal, quietly but unmistakably, that you won't be spoken for. If that's what Nick was doing, it explains why the confession felt both careful and deeply personal. He wasn't spilling details. He was staking a claim. I have lived something. I have carried something. I'm not invisible. And that's exactly why people went speechless. Because the public is used to celebrities asking for attention. It is not used to them asking for dignity. So the question becomes, what does dignity look like for Nick Reiner now? It might look like refusing interviews that reduce him to a family surname. It might look like choosing work that reflects his voice rather than his pedigree. It might look like going quiet and letting the public's hunger burn itself out. Or it might look like doing one serious, controlled, long-form conversation where he speaks plainly and then steps away, closing the door behind him before the internet can kick it open. Whatever he chooses, the confession has already changed the landscape. Because once people hear even a fraction of the truth behind the polish, they can't unhear it. They can only decide what kind of audience they want to be, one that consumes or one that respects. And if Nick is truly stepping into a new phase, one defined by boundaries, self-definition, and emotional clarity, then the next chapter will not be designed to satisfy curiosity. It will be designed to protect a person, which means the biggest shock may still be ahead. Not a revelation. Not a scandal, a disappearance, a refusal, a life restructured away from the world's gaze. And if that happens, fans will finally have to face the most uncomfortable truth of all. Sometimes the most honest ending is the one that gives the audience nothing. And here's where the story becomes genuinely unsettling, because it forces everyone to consider a possibility they don't like. Nick may not be building toward a reveal at all. He may be building toward a separation from the entire machinery that turns human emotion into entertainment. That would explain why his confession felt less like a teaser and more like a release valve. Something said because it had to be said, not because it was strategically useful. When a public figure shifts from performance to honesty, the first consequence is almost always misunderstanding. People interpret honesty through their favorite lens. Some call it courage. Some call it instability. Some call it manipulation. And that split reaction can be brutal because it traps the person in the exact thing they were trying to escape, being defined by other people's stories. Nick's confession triggered that split immediately. You could see it in the comment sections, in the stitched videos, in the analysis threads that treated his tone like a code to be cracked. Fans insisted they were trying to help, but what they were really doing was escalating pressure. Because pressure is not only what comes from fame. Pressure is what comes from being watched while trying to change. That's why the most meaningful question isn't what did Nick confess? It's what did Nick risk? And if the confession was as real as it sounded, he risked a lot. He risked being dismissed as dramatic. He risked being painted as ungrateful. He risked setting off tension in relationships that depend on quiet. He risked losing control of his own narrative the moment it left his mouth. The public assumes confessions are empowering. But in celebrity life, confessions can also be traps because once the internet has a piece of your truth, it will demand the rest of it. And the demand is rarely gentle. In the days after, fans began looking for proof that Nick was either okay or not okay, as if a human being can be reduced to a scoreboard. They dissected Smile's posture, who stood next to him, who didn't. But the strangest part was how quickly the internet tried to turn his confession into a moral drama. Who should apologize? Who should be held accountable? Who should be exposed? That urge reveals how uncomfortable people are with complexity. If Nick's confession was about emotional weight, identity, and long-term pressure, there may not be a villain to expose. There may only be a system that shaped him and a person trying to live inside it. And systems don't trend as easily as villains do. This is why, behind all the chatter, many fans started bracing for the most plausible outcome. Nick stepping back. Not for a week. Not for a short break. A real step back that recalibrates what access looks like. The confession may have been the last human moment he gives the public for a while. Not because he hates his audience, but because he finally understands that the audience, no matter how supportive, cannot hold his life with care. It will always hold it with curiosity first. If Nick chooses that route, the next stage will look boring on paper, but it will be seismic. He may decline interviews. He may stop addressing personal questions entirely. He may focus on work that doesn't require him to sell his inner life. He may simplify his circle, tighten boundaries, and become less interpretable. And when a celebrity becomes less interpretable, the internet tends to panic because it loses its sense of ownership. But panic doesn't mean the story is wrong. It means the story is no longer available. There's also the possibility that the confession was the beginning of a more intentional, controlled honesty, one that doesn't give the public everything, but gives enough to stop the speculation from turning poisonous. That could mean a single, carefully chosen, long-form conversation where Nick frames his experience in human terms. Not accusations, not shock details, but an honest description of what pressure feels like, what it costs, and what he's changing. Done correctly, that kind of conversation can rehumanize a celebrity and de-incentivize the worst interpretations. Done poorly, it can invite more intrusion than ever. Either way, Nick's next move will reveal his real priority: attention or autonomy. And autonomy is where the Reiner name becomes a double-edged blade again. Because autonomy is harder when you are attached to a legacy. People feel entitled to a certain kind of behavior from you. They feel entitled to continuity. They want you to honor the image they've built in their heads. If Nick's confession suggests he is breaking continuity, emotionally, psychologically, maybe even professionally, then the backlash won't necessarily come from haters. Sometimes the harshest backlash comes from fans who feel betrayed that you stop being the version of you they preferred. That is one of the quiet tragedies of fame. You can lose people by becoming healthier. And it's why the confession felt like a warning to some viewers. Not a warning about some external threat, but a warning about what happens when you finally stop performing. When you stop performing, you start disappointing people who benefited from your performance. You start forcing conversations that were avoided. You start revealing how much of stability was actually silence. If Nick has decided to do that, he is not just changing his image. He is changing his relationships to everyone around him, including the public. So what do we do with that as an audience? This is where the story becomes less about Nick and more about us. Because there's an uncomfortable truth hiding underneath this speechless reaction. A lot of people don't actually want celebrities to be honest. They want celebrities to be entertaining. They want pain packaged, redeemable, and resolved in a way that doesn't demand much empathy. Nick's confession demanded empathy. It wasn't clean. It wasn't neat. It wasn't designed to satisfy. And that's why it struck a nerve. If Nick continues choosing honesty, real honesty, not curated vulnerability, then the public will keep trying to turn it into a genre it can understand. Scandal, redemption, feud, breakdown, comeback. But the truth may not fit any of those categories. The truth may simply be a person drawing a line and stepping away from a life that was shaped by expectations he didn't choose. Which means the next chapter may not be louder. It may be quieter, and the quiet will be the point. Because silence can be a retreat, yes, but it can also be a victory. It can be the first time a person stops feeding the machine that consumes them. If Nick Reiner's confession was the moment he exhaled after years of holding his breath, then the most dramatic thing he can do next is live like he doesn't owe anyone the rest of the story. And if he does that, if he truly chooses autonomy over access, then the world will call it shocking. Not because it's scandalous, because it's rare.